Imagine a man who, in a single day, healed 36 sick people, who excommunicated flies and the flies died, who made a king and a queen kneel before him on a hill, crying and begging for the cross, who dictated letters to popes, rebuked emperors, silenced philosophers, and founded more than 100 monasteries, all while his body, ravaged by illness, barely stood. This man was not an emperor. He was not a general. He was a monk. In the heart of the 12th century, an age of iron and faith, of crusades and cathedrals, of kings at war and trembling popes, a single voice rose above all others. A voice that whispered advice to the pontiffs of Rome, thundered sermons to crowds of 100,000, and sang God's love with such deep sweetness that he earned forever the title Doctor Mellifluus, the Mellifluus Doctor. This is the story of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, a young noble destined for worldly glory, who traded his sword for the monk's habit. A man of fragile health and relentless penance, whose influence stretched from the silent cloisters of his abbey to the battlefields of the Second Crusade. A mystic who plunged into the depths of divine love, and a strategist who resolved the schism dividing the church. A man who convinced 31 knights to abandon everything and follow him into monastic life, including his own brothers, his father, and even his worldly sister. How did one man accomplish all this? How did someone who only desired silence and forgetfulness become the arbiter of Europe? And how do his writings, nearly 1,000 years later, continue to be a source of honey for the soul of the church? Prepare yourself. This is a story of love, of battle, of failure, and of glory. This is the extraordinary life of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the last of the church fathers, the giant of the 12th century, the man who loved God without measure. To understand Saint Bernard, you must first understand where he came from, and he came from an extraordinary place. In the year 1090, at Fontaine-le-Dijon Castle in Burgundy, France, the third son was born to one of the region's most noble and devout families. His father was Tescelin Sorel, Tescelin the Red, as he was called for the color of his hair, lord of Fontaine and loyal vassal to the Duke of Burgundy. Tescelin was a knight of the old guard, brave on the battlefield, just in ruling his lands, generous to the poor, and deeply religious. Centuries later, the church would declare him venerable, the first step on the path to beatification. His mother was Aelith de Montbard, a relative of the Duke of Burgundy himself. Aelith was a woman of rare beauty and even rarer devotion. In a time when noblewomen lived for banquets, tournaments, and political games, Aelith stood out for her life of prayer, fasting, and charity. She personally nursed all her children, something unusual for a lady of her class, who would normally have wet nurses do this. She wanted the first nourishment her children received to come from her own breasts, not from a stranger's. It was her way of dedicating each child to God from the very first moment of their life. Together, Tescelin and Aelith had 7 children: Guy, Gerard, Bernard, André, Bartholomew, Humbeline, and Nivard. And here's the first wonder of this extraordinary family. All 7 were declared blessed by the church, a whole family of saints. Father, mother, sons, and daughter, all in the glory of heaven. This did not happen by accident. It happened because Tescelin and Aelith built a home where God was the center of everything. Before Bernard's birth, Aelith had a dream that deeply troubled her. She saw a small dog, white with black spots, barking with surprising strength from inside her own womb. The bark was powerful, persistent, like that of an animal guarding a precious treasure. Worried about the meaning of this vision, she sought the advice of a devout monk she trusted. The monk listened quietly, thought for a moment, and then calmly said, "Fear not, good lady. You will be the mother of a great watchdog of God's house. He will bark with untamable strength against the enemies of the faith, the heretics, and those who corrupt the church. He will be an extraordinary preacher whose barks, his sermons, will heal the souls of many who are sick and drive the wolves away from Christ's flock." Aelith kept these words close to her heart. The white dog, a symbol of purity and loyalty, would become one of St. Bernard's iconic symbols, and the Cistercian monks, dressed in white, would be popularly called God's watchdogs. Bernard grew up in a home where faith was not an obligation but a love. Elith prayed with her children, told them stories of the saints, and taught them to see the poor as the face of Christ. She personally took them to give alms in the villages near the castle. And when she couldn't go, she sent her children in her place. The castle of Fontaine was a microcosm of medieval Christian knighthood at its best, a place where strength was used in the service of justice, where nobility was understood as responsibility, not privilege, where the table was abundant but the heart was even fuller with gratitude to God. Bernard was a child of remarkable physical beauty, bright eyes, golden hair, and an elegant bearing, who would grow into a young man so handsome that his looks would become one of his greatest temptations. But beneath his outward beauty, there was something deeper, a keen spiritual sensitivity, an unusual gift for silence and contemplation for a boy his age, and an intelligence that devoured everything he was taught. Around the year 1100, when Bernard was about 9 or 10 years old, Tessalin sent him to the school of the secular canons at Saint-Vord in Châtillon-sur-Seine. It was the best school in the region, and Tessalin wanted his son to have the most complete education possible, not just for knighthood, but for the life of the spirit. In Châtillon, Bernard threw himself into his studies with a passion that amazed his teachers. He learned Latin with a fluency few students ever reached, and soon he was reading the original works of great classical authors. Virgil with his epic and pastoral poems, Cicero with his political eloquence, Horace with his poetic wisdom, Seneca with his moral philosophy. He absorbed it all, but with a critical discernment that already revealed the future defender of orthodoxy. When lessons contradicted his faith, he turned to prayer and meditation on the scriptures to neutralize the poison inhaled in class, as his biographer would say. But Bernard's greatest passion was not the pagan classics. It was the Bible. He read it, reread it, meditated on it, memorized it. Later, his sermons and letters would be so full of biblical quotations that scholars would count more than 10,000 references to scripture in his writings. The Bible was not just a book to him. It was the air he breathed, the language he thought in, the food that nourished him. Beyond his studies, Bernard stood out for his magnetic personality. He had a natural charm that drew people in, an eloquence that delighted and convinced, and a genuine kindness that made everyone around him feel seen and loved. He was, in short, the kind of young man medieval society destined for the greatest glories. A knight, perhaps a captain, perhaps a lord of vast lands. But then came the blow that would change everything. Elith died when Bernard was about 16. The exact date is unknown, but biographers agree. The death of his mother was the most traumatic event in young Bernard's life. He loved her with an intensity that can only be understood by those who have lost the person they loved most in the world at an early age. Sadness plunged him into a darkness he didn't know how to cross. Without Elith's spiritual anchor, without the beacon of her devotion and love, Bernard began to drift. His sister Humbelan, as worldly as Bernard was spiritual, urged him to distract himself with the young people of the castle, with tournaments, with feasts, with the life a young nobleman of his rank was supposed to live. And Bernard gave in, not in a scandalous way. He never lost his fundamental kindness, but he began to keep company that pulled him away from God. The beauty Elith had dedicated to Christ started to draw looks and intentions that were not holy, and Bernard for the first time felt the full weight of temptation of the flesh. The biographers of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux record with admiration and tenderness an episode that would become legendary. One day, forgetting his usual vigilance, Bernard let his eyes rest for a moment on a woman in a way he shouldn't have. It was only an instant, but it was enough for him to feel, for the first time with complete clarity, the rebellion of the flesh against the spirit. Alarmed, full of remorse, feeling he had betrayed the memory of his mother and the unspoken promise of his life, Bernard didn't hesitate. Without a second thought, he went to a small lake nearby, its waters icy from the Burgundy winter, and plunged into it. He stayed there, still, half frozen, until the fire of passion was completely extinguished and his body was numb from the cold. This episode, which might seem like an eccentricity, reveals something deep about Bernard's character, radical commitment. When he decided something, there was no middle ground. When he loved without reserve. When he fought with everything he had. In that icy lake, he made a decision he would never take back. Perpetual chastity, not as a burden, but as a choice of love. a way of telling God, my body is yours, my heart is yours, all that I am is yours. From that day on, Bernard began to seriously discern the call he felt growing inside him. The world that once attracted him began to seem empty. The glory of knighthood, the tournaments, the feasts, the lands, all of it started to lose its shine before something he still couldn't fully name, but recognized as the only thing worth pursuing. During this time of discernment, Bernard had an experience his biographers describe as an inner illumination. He was riding alone when he felt an irresistible urge to enter a small church by the roadside. He went in, knelt before the altar, and began to pray with an intensity he himself didn't fully understand. He asked God for clarity, direction, the certainty of what he should do with his life. When he rose, all doubt had vanished. He knew, not only that he would enter the monastery, but that he would not go alone. What followed was one of the most extraordinary and unlikely recruitment campaigns in the history of the Catholic Church. A young man of 22, with no formal authority, no position, and no personal wealth, decided to convince his friends, his brothers, and his relatives to give up everything: lands, wives, children, military careers, worldly glory, and follow him into the most austere monastic life that existed. And he succeeded. Bernard did not turn to just any monastery. His heart was set on Citeaux, Cister, a recent foundation seeking a radical return to the original austerity of the rule of Saint Benedict. Founded in 1098 by Saint Robert of Montesma, Cister was a reaction against the luxury and laxity that had crept into many Benedictine monasteries of the time, especially Cluny. The monks of Cister wanted manual labor, silence, true poverty, and sober liturgy, without the golden ornaments, elaborate stained glass, and feasts that characterized other monasteries. At that time, Cister was in crisis. The English abbot St. Stephen Harding, who had led since 1108, was a man of holiness and vision, but the monastery had not received a single new novice in years. The monks were aging, and the future of the reform seemed uncertain. Stephen prayed for vocations, with the persistence of a man who believes God cannot deny what is asked with faith. Bernard was the answer to that prayer. With the same eloquence he once used to charm the halls of castles, Bernard began preaching to his friends and family about the beauty of leaving the world behind for Christ. But it was not just eloquence. It was something deeper, a conviction that came from within, a certainty communicated not only through words, but through his gaze, his posture, and the peace that radiated from his face. His uncle Gaudry, a seasoned and hardened knight, was the first to give in. Gaudry was the kind of man who did not easily give in to anything, but there was something in Bernard's voice that broke through all defenses. After Gaudry came his younger brothers, Bartholomew and Andrew. The eldest brother, Guy, was the hardest case. Guy was married, had 2 young daughters, and loved his family. How could he abandon them? Bernard did not force him. He prayed, and the grace of God worked in a way no one expected. Guy's wife, moved by an inner inspiration, decided on her own to enter a convent. With the family rearranged by divine providence, Guy was free to follow his brothers. Gerard, another brother, was the most unlikely case of all. A soldier passionate about military life, Gerard laughed at Bernard's exhortations, with the good-natured amusement of someone who finds the younger brother's innocence funny. "You're going to the monastery, Bernard. I'll keep the sword." But God had other plans. Gerard was seriously wounded in battle and taken prisoner. While lying in captivity, with time to think that the life of combat had never given him, Bernard's words came back to him with new strength. When he was freed, he went straight to join his brothers. Then came Hugh of Macon, Bernard's close friend, and other nobles from Burgundy. The list grew in a way that seemed impossible. Bernard visited families, talked with parents and children, answered objections, prayed with the hesitant. He didn't manipulate. He simply showed the beauty of a life fully given to God and let grace do the rest. In just a few weeks, Bernard had convinced 31 nobles from Burgundy to join him. 31 knights, students, married men, single men, old and young. An entire generation of Burgundian nobility redirected toward heaven. They didn't leave right away. With the practical wisdom that always marked Bernard, the group gathered for 6 months at Bernard's house in Châtillon to organize their earthly affairs. Wills were written, properties transferred, debts paid, families provided for. Bernard wanted no one to arrive at the monastery with a heart divided by unfinished obligations. During those 6 months, the group already lived like a small monastic community: common prayer, spiritual readings, conversations about God. It was a novitiate before the novitiate. And the group's fame began to spread throughout the region, causing reactions ranging from admiration to scandal. How could a 22-year-old convince 31 men to give up everything? On the day of departure, a moving scene unfolded before the castle of Fontaine. Tesselin, the father, would stay behind with the youngest son, Navard, who was still a child. The old knight blessed his sons with tears in his eyes, not tears of sadness, but of a joy mixed with longing that only parents understand. He had raised his sons for God, and now God was taking them. It was the most complete answer a father could receive. Guy, the eldest brother, turned to little Navard, who was playing in the courtyard, and said with a mix of affection and lightness, "Goodbye, little Navard. You'll have all our lands and properties for yourself." The boy stopped playing, looked at his brothers leaving, and replied with a seriousness that surprised everyone, "So you get heaven and leave me only the earth? That's a very unfair division." Everyone laughed, and then everyone fell silent, because the boy was right, and because everyone knew that when the time came, Navard would also choose heaven. And so it was. Years later, Navard entered the monastery, and Tesselin himself, the old knight who had stayed behind, would also end up receiving the monastic habit from the hands of his own son Bernard at Clairvaux. At Easter in 1112, 32 men, Bernard and his 31 companions, knocked on the doors of the Cistercian monastery. Bernard was 22 years old. Abbot Stephen Harding, who had been praying for vocations for years, welcomed them with tears of joy. It is said he could hardly believe what he saw: 32 novices at once, most of them young nobles who had given up everything. It was the most generous answer God could have given to his prayers. The arrival of Bernard and his companions was the breath of life the Cistercian order needed. From that moment on, Cister would begin to grow in ways no one could have predicted. And at the heart of that growth would always be the figure of Bernard, the young noble who had traded his castle for the cloister. As Cister, Bernard threw himself into monastic life with a zeal that amazed even the oldest monks. He sought forgetfulness, silence, invisibility. He wanted to be the last of the brothers, the most humble, the most hidden. He took part in all the physical work, harvesting, building, cooking, with the same devotion he gave to prayer. His fragile health, however, suffered under the harsh penances he imposed on himself. He ate so little he could barely stand. His nights were spent in vigil. But there was a problem. Bernard could not be invisible. His holiness shone through. His intelligence was clear. His leadership was undeniable. And Abbot Stephen Harding, a man of great wisdom, knew that this young man had not been given to the church to hide away in a cloister. In 1114, Bernard made his solemn monastic vows. In 1115, just 3 years after his arrival, Abbot Stephen Harding made a decision that would change history. He named Bernard, at only 25 years old, abbot of a new foundation. With 12 monks, including his brothers Guy, Gerard, André, and Bartholomew, Bernard was sent to an isolated valley in the Champagne region on the border with Burgundy. The place was known as the Valley of Wormwood, Vallée d'Absinthe, an old hideout for thieves and bandits, a dark and abandoned place no one wanted. Bernard and his monks renamed it. They called that valley Clairvalis, the Clear Valley, in French, Clairvaux, in English, Clairvaux. Shortly after arriving, Bernard was ordained a priest by the Bishop of Chalons, William of Champeaux, one of the greatest theologians of his time, who would become one of Bernard's most loyal friends and admirers. The early years of Clairvaux were marked by a poverty that bordered on misery. The bread was made from coarse barley, sometimes mixed with pea flour. Often the only meal of the day was a watery soup made from beech leaves, the leaves of a tree, not a cultivated vegetable. There were days when the monks had nothing to eat. Bernard, in his initial zeal, was so strict in discipline that the monks, though obedient, began to lose heart. He demanded from himself and others a rigor that, over time, he himself would recognize as excessive, not from a lack of faith, but from a lack of mercy toward himself and his brothers. One revealing episode, Brother Gerard, who served as the community's treasurer, came to Bernard with a practical concern. "Brother," he said, "we are 12 pounds short to cover the community's most urgent needs. We have no way to pay." Bernard listened, paused, and simply said, "Let us pray." He gathered the monks in prayer. Shortly after, a noblewoman appeared at the monastery gates, asking for prayers for her seriously ill husband. She left as an offering, exactly 12 pounds. When she returned home, she found her husband healed. God's providence had answered with a precision that left no doubt. Over time, Bernard learned to balance rigor with mercy. The biographer William of St. Thierry describes a remarkable transformation. The severe abbot who demanded the impossible became a father who knew each son by name, who understood their weaknesses and strengths, who wept with those who wept and laughed with those who laughed. He learned that holiness is not a performance of perfection, but a path of love, and that love begins with compassion. Clairvaux grew rapidly. Bernard's fame attracted novices from all over Europe. In just a few years, the small monastery in the Valley of Wormwood had transformed into a major spiritual center. And from Clairvaux, like a spring, dozens of new foundations flowed forth. In 1118, La Ferté. In 1119, Pontigny. In 1121, Morimond and Clairvaux-le-Grand. By the time of Bernard's death in 1153, the Cistercian order counted more than 160 monasteries spread across Europe, from Ireland to Poland, from Scotland to Sicily. One episode that remained in the memory of the Cistercian tradition, at the Abbey of Foigny in Picardy, during the ceremony to consecrate the new church, a cloud of flies invaded the sacred space, disturbing the liturgy. Bernard, with the authority of one accustomed to being obeyed, said aloud, "I excommunicate these flies." The next day, the abbey floor was covered with dead flies. The episode, recorded by his contemporary biographers, became one of the most famous of his life, and a symbol of the spiritual authority God had granted him. Bernard was also the inspiration behind the rule of the Knights Templar. In 1129, at the Council of Troyes, he helped draft the rule that would define the life of the warrior monks of the Order of the Temple. He also wrote for them the treatise De Laude Novae Militiae, the praise of the new knighthood, in which he defended the idea that it was possible to be both a monk and a warrior, as long as the sword served Christ and not personal ambition. Hugh of Paynes, the first master of the Templars, was Bernard's cousin, and it was to him that Bernard dedicated the treatise. In the year 1130, the Catholic Church faced a crisis that threatened to tear Christendom apart. Two men claimed the throne of St. Peter at the same time. On one side was Cardinal Gregory Papareschi, elected by a majority of the cardinals, and he took the name Innocent II. On the other was Cardinal Pietro Pierleoni, supported by a rival faction, and who took the name Anacletus II. Anacletus had the support of Rome and Sicily. Innocent had the support of most of Europe, but he was in exile in France. This was the Great Schism of 1130, and the Church needed someone with enough moral authority to resolve the crisis. All eyes turned to Bernard. Bernard examined the circumstances of both elections with the carefulness of a lawyer and the insight of a theologian. He concluded that Innocent II's election was the legitimate one. Then, with the energy of a man who knows he is right and has no time to waste, he launched a campaign across Europe that lasted for years. He traveled to France, where he convinced King Louis VI to recognize Innocent. He went to Germany, where he persuaded Emperor Lothair III. He went to England, where he won over King Henry I. He went to Italy, where he convinced the northern cities. In every court, every cathedral, every assembly, Bernard's voice was the most persuasive, the clearest, the most unstoppable. Anacletus II died in 1138. His successor, Victor IV, recognized Innocent II and stepped down. The schism was over. And Europe knew who to thank for its resolution. The monk of Clairvaux, who had traveled the entire continent with a sick body but an iron will. But the most intellectually dramatic battle of Bernard's life was still to come. Peter Abelard was the greatest philosopher and theologian of his time. Brilliant, innovative, and captivating in his intelligence, Abelard had revolutionized the teaching of theology in Paris with his dialectical method, using philosophical reason to examine and question the truths of faith. His students adored him. His fame was immense. But Bernard saw in Abelard a serious danger, not because Abelard was ill-intentioned. Bernard recognized his brilliance. The problem was that Abelard, in his excessive confidence in human reason, was unknowingly undermining the foundations of faith. He proposed interpretations of the Trinity that bordered on modalism. He reduced redemption to a mere moral example. He treated the mysteries of faith as philosophical problems to be solved by logic. For Bernard, there was a line that reason could not cross without losing its way: the mystery. Faith is not opinion, he wrote. It is certainty. It is not a hypothesis to be tested, but a truth to be lived. The confrontation reached its peak at the Council of Sens in 1140. Abelard had challenged Bernard to a public debate. Bernard accepted, but not to debate. He went to the council to present a formal charge of heresy, with a list of erroneous propositions taken from Abelard's writings. Abelard arrived at the council confident. But when the moment came, before the gathered bishops and Bernard's formal accusation, something unexpected happened. Abelard refused to defend his positions. He asked for the case to be referred to the Pope, and he withdrew. Pope Innocent II condemned Abelard's propositions. Abelard appealed, but his health was ruined. He retired to the monastery of Cluny under the protection of Peter the Venerable, and there, in the last months of his life, something happened that reveals the greatness of both men. Bernard and Abelard were reconciled. Bernard visited Abelard at Cluny. The two men talked, prayed together, and Abelard died at peace with the Church and with Bernard. Pope Benedict XVI, commenting on this episode in a general audience in 2009, said, "The attitude that prevailed in both men must be taken seriously when a theological controversy arises, safeguarding the faith of the Church and ensuring the triumph of truth and charity." In 1148, at the Council of Rheims, Bernard stood against Gilbert of Poitiers, Bishop of Poitiers, who tried to explain the mystery of the Holy Trinity through philosophical categories that, in practice, separated the divine essence from the divine persons, a subtle but serious error that threatened the doctrine of the Trinity. Bernard made a formal charge of heresy. The council examined Gilbert's positions, and Gilbert, faced with the evidence presented, publicly recanted. The doctrine of the Trinity was reaffirmed. In 1145, Bernard was sent to southern France to fight the Cathar heresy, a movement that denied the goodness of the material world, rejected the sacraments, and promoted a dualistic spirituality that was, in practice, a completely different religion from Christianity. Bernard preached for weeks in Languedoc, with some success, but he himself admitted that the heresy was deeply rooted in the region, and that preaching alone would not be enough. A long-term effort of education and witness would be necessary. It would be Saint Dominic, decades later, who would complete this work. Before we reach the climax of Bernard's public life, the preaching of the Second Crusade, we need to understand one of the most extraordinary relationships of his life, his relationship with Pope Eugene III. Bernard Pignatelli, born in Pisa, had entered Clairvaux as a novice under the direction of Saint Bernard himself. He was a humble, obedient monk with a deep spiritual life. Bernard loved him like a spiritual son. In 1145, to everyone's astonishment, including Bernard's own, Bernard, Pignatelli was elected pope. He took the name Eugene III. Bernard was stunned. He wrote to the new pope with a mix of joy and alarm, "I rejoice for the Church, but I tremble for you. Who has given the people a man after your own heart? Who has given the people a man after God's heart?" And then, with the frankness only a spiritual father can have, "Remember who you were before you were pope. Remember Clairvaux. Remember who you are." The relationship between these two men during Eugene III's papacy was unique in the history of the Church. Bernard wrote to the Pope with a freedom that bordered on impertinence, but which was, in truth, the greatest act of love a teacher can show a disciple. He corrected him when he was wrong. He encouraged him when he hesitated. He advised him in every major decision. And it was to Eugene III that Bernard wrote one of his most important works, On Consideration, a guide to spirituality for those who govern. In it, Bernard warns the Pope against the dangers of power, vanity, and the restlessness that blocks contemplation. Consider what you are, who you are, what kind of man you must be. It is a text still read by church leaders today. In December 1144, the city of Edessa, one of the Christian states founded by the First Crusade in what is now southeastern Turkey, fell into the hands of Sultan Zengi. It was the first major setback for the Christian states of the East since the First Crusade, and it sent a shock of terror throughout Christian Europe. Pope Eugene III, who was exiled in France due to political conflicts in Rome, issued a papal bull calling for a Second Crusade, and then he wrote to his spiritual master, Bernard, you must preach this crusade. No one else has the moral authority, the eloquence, and the reputation needed to rally Europe. Bernard resisted. He was a monk. He was not a war preacher. But Eugene insisted. And Bernard, with the obedience he always placed above his personal preferences, agreed. What happened in Vézelay on Easter Sunday, March 31st, 1146, is one of the most dramatic moments in medieval history. Bernard had called a gathering in the town of Vézelay in Burgundy. The news spread throughout France. The abbot of Clairvaux was going to preach, and people came. They came from all over, knights and peasants, bishops and merchants, nobles and beggars. The crowd was so huge that no church or square could hold them all. They had to build a large wooden platform on the side of a hill outside the city walls. King Louis VII of France was there, dressed in his royal robes, beside his wife, the famous Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and fascinating women of her time. Bishops and archbishops from all over France were present, and a crowd that chroniclers estimate numbered in the tens of thousands. Bernard climbed the platform. His body was frail. Years of penance and illness had left their marks. But when he opened his mouth, the voice that came out was not that of a weak man. It was the voice of someone speaking with the strength of a conviction that came from far beyond himself. He began by reading the letter from Pope Eugene III calling for the crusade. Then, with the eloquence he had perfected over decades of preaching, he spoke. How can you not know that we live in a time of punishment and ruin? The enemy of humanity has blown the wind of corruption over all lands. We see nothing but unpunished evil. Neither the laws of men nor the laws of religion have enough power to stop the decay of morals and the triumph of the wicked. He spoke of the desecration of holy places. He spoke of the Christians in the East, their brothers in faith, living under the yoke of the unbelievers. He spoke of the shame that would fall on Christendom if it did not answer the call. And then, with an image that would be etched in the memory of all present, if the enemy had invaded your cities, your lands, had violated your wives and daughters, desecrated your temples, who among you would not take up arms? Well, all this and much worse has happened to your brothers, to the family of Jesus Christ, which is also yours. Why do you hesitate? The effect was electrifying. The entire crowd, as if one being, began to shout, God wills it! God wills it! The same cry that had echoed in Clermont 50 years before, when Pope Urban II had preached the First Crusade. King Louis VII rose from the throne where he had been sitting and knelt at Bernard's feet, asking for the cross. Eleanor of Aquitaine followed him. Then bishops and knights, one after another. The demand for cloth crosses, the symbol of the Crusader, was so overwhelming that the ones Bernard had brought ran out in minutes. He tore his own robe to make more crosses, and when his robe was gone, others began tearing their own clothes. The hill of Vézelay echoed for hours with the singing and crying of a crowd swept up by a feeling that was more than just human. But Bernard was not finished. Pope Eugene wanted Germany to join the crusade as well, and Germany was ruled by Emperor Conrad III, a practical man, skeptical of the Crusades, who had resisted every call before. Bernard went to Germany. He preached in Freiburg, in Constance, in Basel, in Schaffhausen. In every city, crowds gathered to hear him. In every city, men took the cross. The meeting with Conrad III in Speyer at Christmas of 1146 is one of the most dramatic moments in Bernard's life. Bernard preached before the emperor and the entire court. Then, in a gesture that surprised everyone, he turned directly to Conrad and said, with a fierce intensity that allowed no reply, "Man, What more could God have done for you that he has not yet done? On Judgment Day, he will ask you, what should I have done for you that I did not? What will you answer? Conrad III, the emperor who had resisted every plea, began to weep, and he asked for the cross. During his campaign through Germany, Bernard performed an extraordinary number of miraculous healings. Chroniclers recorded that in a single day in Constance, he healed 36 sick people, blind, paralyzed, deaf, mute. Throughout the campaign along the Rhine, it is estimated that he healed an average of 3 sick people a day. These miracles were witnessed by many and recorded by contemporary chroniclers. The Second Crusade set out in 1147 with the highest hopes. 2 kings, 1 emperor, dozens of princes and barons, hundreds of thousands of warriors. It was the greatest military effort of Christendom since the First Crusade, and it ended in complete disaster. The German army was destroyed by hunger and disease before it even reached the Holy Land. The French army suffered humiliating defeats. The attempt to capture Damascus, the main goal of the campaign, failed in just 4 days in July 1148 because of disagreements among the Crusaders. The armies returned to Europe having conquered nothing. Europe was stunned. How could this be? God had promised victory. Bernard had preached the crusade. How could God have allowed this failure? Bernard suffered deeply. He had preached the crusade with all the conviction of his soul. He had convinced kings and emperors. He had promised in the name of God that the cause was just and that God would bless it. And now, faced with failure, he was the target of bitter criticism, not only from enemies, but from friends and disciples as well. He wrote to Pope Eugene III, taking moral responsibility for the failure. He did not shy away, nor did he make excuses. He admitted that he had preached with excessive confidence, and he offered a theological explanation that revealed the depth of his faith. The failure was not proof that God had abandoned the crusade. It was a punishment for the sins of the crusaders, who had taken up the cross with their lips, but had not changed their hearts. God's judgments are true and just, he wrote, but they are also unfathomable. Who am I to question what he allows? If Bernard was a giant in action, in the Schism, in Abelard, in the Crusade, it was in the silence of his cell, in contemplation and writing, that his soul found its highest expression. His sermons and treatises are like a river of honey, flowing with a sweetness and depth that earned him the title Doctor Mellifluus, the Doctor of Honey. For Bernard, knowledge had no value unless it led to love. The reason to love God, he wrote, is God himself. The measure of that love is to love without measure. His theology was not abstract speculation, but a lived experience, a path of the soul's ascent to mystical union with its Creator. His masterpiece is the 86 Sermons on the Song of Songs, the most mysterious and beautiful book of the Bible. Bernard worked on them for 18 years, from 1135 until his death in 1153, never finishing them. He reached only the 3rd chapter of the 8-chapter book. For Bernard, the Song of Songs was not just a poem about human love. It was an allegory of the love between Christ and the soul, or between Christ and the church. The bridegroom who seeks the bride, who calls her, who embraces her, who kisses her with the kiss of his mouth. All of this was, for Bernard, a description of the mystical life, the soul's journey toward union with God. These sermons are considered, by many scholars, the highest point of Western Christian mysticism. They describe, with a precision and beauty that still astonish today, the stages of the inner life: purification, illumination, contemplation, union. They are at once rigorous theology and love poetry. In the treatise on the love of God, Bernard describes the 4 stages by which the soul rises toward God. The first stage is self-love for oneself. Selfish love, the kind that seeks only one's own good. It is the starting point of every human soul. The second stage is love of God out of self-interest. The love that recognizes God as the source of all good things and seeks Him for that reason. It is still an imperfect love, but it is a beginning. The third stage is love of God for who He is. The love that loves God not for what He gives, but for what He is. It is the love of friendship, the love of contemplation. And the fourth stage, the peak of the mystical life, which Bernard said he had experienced only rarely and for brief moments, is love of oneself only because of God. It is when the soul completely forgets itself and is lost in God, like a drop of water falling into the ocean and becoming the ocean. To love oneself because of God, Bernard wrote, is the perfection of charity. When this happens, the soul no longer thinks of itself, but only of God. It is the state of the blessed in heaven. At the heart of Bernard's spirituality was a tender, personal, and passionate love for Jesus Christ. Not the abstract Christ of philosophy, but Jesus of Nazareth, the baby of Bethlehem, the preacher of Galilee, the crucified one of Calvary, the risen one from the tomb. Bernard was one of the first theologians to systematically develop devotion to the humanity of Christ, to the Jesus who wept, who hungered, who suffered, who loved. In a time when theology tended to focus on the divinity of Christ, Bernard insisted that it was through Jesus, humanity, that the human soul could draw near to God. Inseparable from his love for Jesus was his devotion to the Virgin Mary. For Bernard, Mary was the mediator of all graces, the star of the sea, who guides sailors through this stormy world to the safe harbor of Christ. He wrote about Mary with a filial tenderness that touched hearts. His sermons on the Missus Est, the angel's announcement to Mary, are considered masterpieces of medieval Mariology. He saw in Mary the perfect model of all Christian life, the humility that says yes to God, the faith that never hesitates, the love that offers itself without reservation. Tradition credits him with the beautiful final invocations of the Hail Holy Queen prayer, O clement, O loving, O sweet Virgin Mary, and also the moving Memorare prayer. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, that never was it known that anyone who fled to your protection, implored your help, or sought your intercession was left unaided. It is said that at the Abbey of Trefontaine in Rome, there was an image of the Virgin that Bernard would greet with a Hail Mary every time he passed by. It was a simple, everyday gesture, the expression of a filial love that needed no grand words. One day, to his surprise, the image answered. The Virgin simply said, Hail Bernard. This dialogue, Hail Mary and Hail Bernard, was carved in stone on the Abbey wall, where it remains to this day. It sums up, with a simplicity that touches the heart, the close and loving relationship the saint had with the Mother of God. Bernard was not a man without contradictions. The same man who wrote, with a sweetness like honey, about God's love, could be sharp, even cutting, when it came to defending what he believed to be true. His dispute with Cluny, the great Benedictine monastery in Burgundy, a symbol of medieval wealth and liturgical splendor, is one example. The monks of Cluny favored beauty as a way to encourage prayer. Vast churches with golden vaults, rich ornaments, elaborate sculptures, colorful stained glass. For them, beauty was a path to God. Bernard disagreed, radically. In his Apology to William of Saint Thierry, he wrote with an irony that still amuses readers today. What are those ridiculous figures doing in those cloisters before the eyes of the studying brothers? That beautiful deformity or that deformed beauty? What use are those filthy monkeys, those fierce lions, those monstrous centaurs, those half-men? For Bernard, outward beauty distracted the monk from the only beauty that mattered, God's. The Cistercian cloister had to be bare, simple, austere, so that nothing would keep the soul from rising toward the invisible. The debate was heated. Peter the Venerable, abbot of Cluny, responded strongly, but despite their differences, the two men always maintained a relationship of respect and friendship, which in itself is a testament to the greatness of both. Bernard's final years were marked by illness and suffering. His body, worn down by a life of relentless penance and tireless work, had reached its limit. He suffered from chronic stomach pains that had troubled him since his novitiate years, worsened by decades of extreme fasting. He could barely eat, he could barely sleep. In 1152, he fell so gravely ill that everyone thought he would die. His monks gathered at his bedside. Bishops and abbots from all over Europe sent messages. Pope Eugene III prayed for him. Then came a request that seemed impossible to fulfill. The Bishop of Metz wrote urgently. A civil war was devastating his diocese, with death and destruction everywhere. Only Bernard had the moral authority to bring the sides together. Please, let him come. The dying man rose from his bed. He traveled to Metz. He gathered the conflicting parties. He spoke with each of them. And he achieved peace, a peace that lasted. Then he returned to Clairvaux, exhausted, closer to the end than ever before. His monks, gathered around his bedside, wept and begged him not to leave them. Bernard looked at them with a love that needed no words. And with his last strength, he said, I do not know which of the two I must surrender to, the love of my children who urge me to stay here below, or the love of my God who calls me above. He died on August 20th, 1153, at the age of 63 in Clairvaux, the valley he had founded 40 years earlier, the place that had been his home, his school, his sanctuary. Only 21 years later, in 1174, Pope Alexander III canonized him. It was one of the fastest canonizations in medieval history, a sign that Bernard's holiness was recognized by all without any doubt. In 1830, Pope Pius VIII declared him a doctor of the Church, one of only 37 saints to receive this title throughout the entire history of the Church. His title, Doctor Mellifluus, the Mellifluous Doctor. In 1953, Pope Pius XII wrote the encyclical Doctor Mellifluus in his honor, declaring, his work must be carefully studied, for from its content, which is truly drawn from the Gospels, a new and heavenly strength can flow both for individual life and for social life. The legacy of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux is vast and many-sided. He reformed monastic life and founded 160 monasteries. He advised popes and rebuked emperors. He fought heresies and restored the unity of the Church. He preached a crusade and suffered its failure. He wrote mystical treatises that continue to nourish the soul of the Church nearly 1,000 years later. But perhaps his greatest legacy is something simpler and deeper than all of that. It is the testimony of an entire family, father, mother, 6 sons, and a daughter, who chose God above all else. It is the story of a young nobleman who plunged into an icy lake to preserve his purity. It is the story of a monk who convinced 31 knights to trade their swords for the monastic habit. It is the story of a man who loved God without measure, and who, because of that, was able to love others with a generosity that still amazes us today. Saint Bernard teaches us that true greatness is not found in power or fame, but in humility and service. That the path to holiness is a path of love, a love that begins in the silence of a cloister and stretches out, like the arms of a cross, to the ends of the earth. May his intercession grant us the grace to love God without measure, as he loved. The story you have just heard is only one of many extraordinary stories that the Sancti at Heroes channel has to share with you. Saints and heroes of faith who lived lives that seem impossible, and who, precisely because of that, show us that with God, nothing is impossible. If this episode touched your heart, if the life of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux inspired you, we invite you to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. That way you won't miss any episodes. And if you know someone who needs to hear stories like this, a friend, a family member,